DebtBusters' latest debt index for second quarter 2020 reveals that South African consumers' debt levels continued to deteriorate over the lockdown, with higher income earners in particular having that unsustainability debt to income ratios. Net incomes of consumers have declined in real terms, and consumers are supplementing this by borrowing heavily, especially using unsecured loans. Benay Sager, DebtBusters Chief Operating Officer, joins us now live via Skype to explain to us more about this. Good afternoon to you, Benay. Thank you so much for joining us here on the SABC News channel.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you so much indeed for coming through. So are you surprised by this trend of consumers borrowing more heavily during this lockdown period?
Yeah, so every quarter we look at the incoming class of consumers who sign up to DebtBusters for debt counselling. And we do thorough assessments of their financial situation, including their debt, including their expenses and their incomes. And when we looked at the period from April to June of this year, which has been essentially the first 3 months of the national lockdown, the consumers who sign up with DebtBusters, we saw that their debt levels compared to previous years was significantly higher. And we believe that that is driven mainly as a result of incomes not growing. And what we've seen is over the last 4 years, essentially since 2015, 2016, the income levels of the consumers for all income bands, all the way from those earning less than 5,000 Rand to those earning more than 20,000 Rand, the income levels have been more or less the same. When you factor in the inflation over those years, it actually means the real incomes of these consumers have gone backwards, unfortunately. So it hasn't grown, and they've actually become poorer. And as a result, it brings us to the second significant finding, which is to say that debt levels, particularly those earning more than 10,000 Rand per month, have gone up significantly. And this is driven predominantly by personal loans and credit card spending. That's what we're seeing.
So what are they using this money for? Because the trend has been for consumption of luxury goods and entertainment, but I suppose this is a bit limited now.
Yeah, it's not for that at all. Actually, I really feel for our consumers. They've been really under a lot of strain for a long time, for the last several years. Consumers are using this money they borrow to pay for basic necessities. Their incomes haven't grown. And in fact, if you factor in inflation, we took CPI. But in reality, when you factor in the increases in electricity price, transport and petrol costs, the real impact of that is probably far higher on consumers. And we asked the question, what do they use the money for? And the answer is they use it to help their families put food on the table. They use it to pay for medical aid and other expenses. They use it for transport. They use it for paying kids' schooling. So ordinary everyday expenses is the answer in terms of what consumers are using this extra money for.
But I think what's a bit of a worry here is the fact that they're getting unsecured loans. What's this saying about the National Credit Act? Is it not effective enough?
With the National Credit Act, the different types of loans one can borrow was classified. So when we say unsecured, we refer to personal loans, credit cards, or store cards. It's all regulated by the National Credit Act and the regulations that have come into effect. So there's nothing wrong there. I think the difficulty is that consumers feel like they don't have any other option other than borrowing money. And what we are seeing is that larger size loans are being borrowed by the same consumers. It used to be that consumers would get, let's say, 5,000 to 10,000 Rand loans. Now we're seeing 20, 30, 50, and sometimes up to 120,000 Rand loans that consumers are borrowing. I think that's the difficulty in terms of paying that back. It's going to take consumers somewhere between 8 to 10 years.
But in terms of, because we do know that we also have informal lenders, are they still operative in this day and age?
So the statistics that we see are all formal lending. We're unable to see what we call informal lending that takes place. The size of that is probably relatively small compared to formal lending. So we are only able to see the formal lending as that's what gets reported to the credit bureaus. But on top of this, there's also, of course, the informal lending, which is generally used by consumers for everyday purchases, bread and milk. And generally, they come in a much smaller loan sizes, somewhere between 300 to 2,000 Rand. And those are generally short term. So those are excluded from our analysis because we don't have access to that data. If we did, I think the picture would probably look even a little bit more grim than what we are painting here.
What have your observations been, though, in terms of debt counselling? Is it working for consumers so far?
So what we see is that year in, year out, the number of consumers and the ratio of consumers successfully completing debt counselling continues to go up. The debt counselling was put in place as part of the National Credit Act precisely for the reason to try to help consumers who are struggling to pay back their debt, the consumers who are really unable to make ends meet on a month-to-month basis. And what we see is that often when consumers come to us, they need almost 2/3 of their net income to pay back their debt on a monthly basis. And as you and our viewers can imagine, this is not really sustainable in the long term. You cannot keep paying 2/3 of your net income towards debt month in and month out and make ends meet. So in our view, debt counseling would work for many individuals. Of course, it's not for everyone. But, when we speak to consumers at DebtBusters, we do a thorough assessment to determine who is eligible for it. Consumers need to show a way of earning an income, so they need to have an income, and then they need to be able to what we call to be over-indebted, meaning the debt repayments and the monthly expenses need to be more than their net income. And I believe, especially with the impact of the lockdown and the delayed effect of the bank payment holidays, I believe many more consumers would probably benefit from debt counseling. So I would urge consumers to speak to a reputable licensed debt counselor and get a free assessment to understand their financial situation.
All right, that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you so much for coming through. That's Benay Sager. He's DebtBusters Chief Operating Officer, talking to us about the latest debt index for the second quarter of 2020, which reveals that South African consumer debt levels continued to go down over the lockdown, with higher income earners in particular having that unsustainable debt-to-income ratios. So let's take a quick